Hello, everyone. This is Paul Quigley, the CEO at NewsWhip, with Ben Nicholson, the head of the NewsWhip Research Center. And you were joining us for the first ever edition of the NewsWhip Pulse. So thank you for taking the time out to join us today. Brief background to the Pulse. Every 2 weeks, we're going to be looking at the trends in engagement with news and other content, sometimes diving into the big stories of the week, but also picking out some of the bigger, more important trends that we think people in media and comms are going to care about. We want this to be interactive, and we're working out all of the details. For now, we're going to be using the chat function in Zoom. So if you have any questions or comments, please use the chat function. I think it defaults to public, and you can also anonymously submit. And Danielle from our team is going to triage some questions for me and Ben to address in the back half of our show. This is our first edition. Again, we wanted to invite some of our friends and close clients, and we aim to grow this a little bit over time because we think there's a lot going on in the world of content engagement and not enough real analysis based on the numbers. The other thing about this webinar is it's short. We want to keep it to 30 minutes. One of our product team's motto is to give our users speed to insight. So we want to try and achieve that with this show as well. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Ben. And what we want to do with our first show was kind of look back at 2020 so far, because it's been a pretty unprecedented year in a lot of ways, of course, but in particular with content and engagement. Ben, maybe if we could open up by talking a bit about what's happened so far this year and what's been changing compared to previous years.
Yeah, thanks, Paul, and thanks again for having me on here. It's going to be really exciting to talk through these trends as they happen and keep an eye on them as they progress. So really excited to be a regular on here. In terms of your question, I think there's lots of interesting stuff that's happened, but maybe the most interesting thing is just to look at the sheer numbers of engagement that have happened in 2020 so far. So we track things like the engagement to web content. And when I talk about engagements, what I mean in this context is engagements to web content and Facebook. So that might be a Facebook like, a comment, or a share on a URL. So we look at that, and we've looked at that over the past few years. And in 2017, it was hovering around 10 billion engagements for the first half of 2017, actually a little above that, close to 15 billion engagements. Then in 2018, we saw that drop a little to around 10 billion. And then in 2019, we saw that rise back up again to slightly above 2017 levels. So around 15 billion engagements to English language web content on Facebook for the first half of the year. And then what we've seen in 2020 is that's just exploded. And, there are obvious reasons for that in the coronavirus and the Black Lives Matter protests. But even before that, we were seeing it start to really rise up. So we do these monthly publisher rankings where in 2019, the top publisher was getting about 50 million engagements a month. And then all of a sudden in January, we saw the Daily Mail out of nowhere get 90 million engagements. And a lot of the top stories at the start of the year were around the Australian wildfires, got huge engagement, Kobe Bryant's death. But there was also some fluffy stuff in there as well, the kind of engagement-based stuff you'd expect that we kind of got used to. But then obviously all that began to change in March.
And what we're looking at here, I suppose, is apples with apples. We won't look at the first half of each year because we're only halfway through 2020, but a trend line that was definitely on the way up. And we've even seen that within the years, right, Ben? That
exactly, yeah.
Rankings, it's been moving on up. And is that continuing right now as we move into the back half of 2020?
It's slowing down a little, to be honest. The publisher rankings for this month, they're not out yet, but the top publisher has about 90 million engagements again, as opposed to NBC News had 130 million engagements last month. So there's a slight decrease, but it's still way above where it was last year.
Okay, so we're still a big trend line, bit of an extra bump on top, but we're still moving way up in terms of engagement. And publishers, and many publishers I think are joining us here today, should be feeling that, or seeing many publishers should be seeing that in their numbers. So maybe we should jump over to the big story kind of the year, Ben, coronavirus and engagement with that content.
Yeah, so coronavirus began to get really big in the US at the beginning of March. So there had been some media attention while the virus was more in China, or reported as being in China, but the public wasn't really engaged with it as much. But then when it hit Europe is when the US audience began to really truly pay attention. And then obviously as it spread throughout the United States and the crisis got worse in the United States, that's when people were really paying attention here.
Right,
And
let
there were
me
actually,
get up our beautiful graphic for that amazing
oh, lovely,
cliff
yeah.
of
So you
explosion
can
of
see
engagement.
that huge spike there at the beginning of March, where actually it achieved over 1 billion engagements to the topic at the beginning of March, and that's just not something that's ever happened before. That's to a single topic. That's absolutely huge. And there were times when actually it was 1.5 times as much engagement to coronavirus content than all non-coronavirus content combined, which is just a stunning stat. Like when we found that, I was completely blown away by that, because that's just not something that happens, that a single topic dominates to that level. And then as you can see, it's kind of gone down a bit since then, but it's still a very, very good level of engagement to coronavirus content. And it's about 3-to-1 now, the ratio of coronavirus to non-coronavirus. So 1 in 4 engagements roughly is coming to coronavirus content in the US now.
Mm-hmm. So there's news stories about coronavirus, statements from public health authorities about coronavirus, etc., right?
Exactly, and as it spreads to different places in the country, it gets reported differently. And you have the almost second wave or new wave in Arizona, Texas, Florida, that came after the initial wave in March in New York, that created a whole new range of reporting on the coronavirus and how localities were dealing with it. So it just continues to get massive engagement.
Incredible. I wonder, so coronavirus, the social news internet's pretty new, maybe 10 years old. Like, it's the first, and it's, Facebook is the biggest news distribution platform in history by a big margin. And here we see a story, the speed at which a story just dominates the whole network and becomes more than half, or, outweighs everything else that's going on. And it is quite incredible. So what were the kinds of content that were getting the most engagement, and how are they different to regular news content then?
Yeah, so it's been a little variable, to be honest. I mean, there has been just a lot of straight news in there, but in terms of things we saw that maybe were different from what we would expect, especially early on in March, and we're going to talk about this a bit later when we talk about the iffy quotient, I think, but people really turned to articles to explain what was happening. So that was the first thing we saw, that explainer articles were performing much better on average than they tended to perform. And we saw websites like Vox, which is known for its explainers, The Atlantic, which really went in depth on some of its explanatory coverage, doing really, really well. And then a Washington Post graphic explaining how diseases like this can spread exponentially via data visualization got, I think, 6 million engagements, which is just a huge, huge number. And then the other thing we saw that was a little different from maybe what we would expect was the rise of positive stories. So what I mean by that, and it happened on a personal and a company level, is people banding together to feel some kind of community in taking on the virus, basically. So one of the early stories we saw was in an Italian town. There were people gathering on their balconies to sing and have a bit of community and create a bit of community spirit in the face of this great international tragedy. And that was one of the big early, highly engaged stories we saw. But it wasn't necessarily limited to people doing stuff just naturally, organically. I mean, there were also brands that got involved. And when that was most effective and resonated most with people was when they extended their business in some way to help during the time of coronavirus. So we saw a couple of really salient examples of that with Anheuser-Busch, for example, who started making hand sanitizer in their plants in addition to the alcohol, so that they could then distribute that to customers and people who needed it. And another one on a more industrial scale, I guess, is Ford and 3M partnered to create ventilators in their factories when they weren't able to produce cars at the time. So just that action of extending what your business is good at, what your business does, to be pro-social and act for good in the world was something that really resonated with people and something that the public really appreciated. And there was lots of positive engagement with those kinds of stories.
They're really, I mean, human nature could go either way, right? It was kind of comforting that what we saw happen was a drive towards, explainers and people wanting to understand, as opposed to, that's what people went to the internet to do, and then to share that content. And the pro-social was a trend that we spotted as well. Of people in communications, great celebration of things like Audible, giving free access temporarily to their libraries, to Scholastic giving free e-learning, and to some degree these are even pro-social things that are very good for the business. They're driving sign-ups and leads, but we're still getting huge shares on Facebook because people wanted to share that there was this good thing, and people themselves are being useful then when they share that kind of helpful information, that this brand is giving away this digital good for free. Isn't this neat? I mean, there were some huge earned wins, I think, in that way around coronavirus. So I think the other huge story I just wanted to add that Danielle is adding links to some of these, and we have explored a couple of these themes in some articles. So those are going to appear in the chat. So if anything that we're talking about, either the content or any explorations we've written on them, sounds of interest, check the chat and you'll find the link to those. So the other big story of this year, of course, has been Black Lives Matter, George Floyd's death, the protest resulting from that. So can you tell us a bit about what the engagement on that's looked like, Ben?
Yeah, obviously we can't talk about 2020 without talking about this. It's the one thing that people moved away from talking about coronavirus to talk about, just because it's such a vital topic. And it was at the end of May, the killing of George Floyd caused these massive protests, both nationally and internationally, as people called for racial equity, racial justice. And that you can see there, I talked about coronavirus getting huge engagement. This was massive even compared to coronavirus engagement at the time when it was happening. So just people going out and calling for this racial justice and racial equity was something that was so important that it cut through a massive story that already existed, which is wonderful news. And the biggest story in terms of engagement that we saw actually was people sharing when police officers joined protesters in marching against police brutality and taking a knee to do that. This is a story from Forbes that got, I think, 15 million engagements at the time, and still rising since then, I think. So it just shows the power of that narrative, of the call for racial justice and the urgency of the call for racial justice and equity at this time.
There's quite a kind of an almost a unifying kind of a picture there in a sense as well. And I think what we saw looking at the most engaged with stories, right, Ben, is that there's some of them aren't always what you'd expect, and it's probably worthwhile. We have a lot of our users here online. If you want to dig into this, it's quite a lot of insight, I think, to be seen to see what people were engaging with around the Black Lives Matter protests and movement, and are continuing to engage with.
Yeah, precisely.
Because that's a story that's definitely continuing and it's going to be staying with us for the year and beyond. So let me just move. There's one thing that maybe isn't as relevant for Black Lives Matter, but it's very relevant for coronavirus, is misinformation, and it's kind of perennial topic in social news. So what's happening in misinformation this year? Is it different to previous years? What does our data say?
Yeah, so I think a big shift that we've seen kind of since 2016 really is that outright fake news isn't really a thing anymore in terms of what gets shared. And actually what we've seen, and this is through a partner of ours, the University of Michigan, they have this thing called the IFI quotient, which I'll just explain quickly. They look at a subset of websites that they consider to be iffy based on, I believe, ratings from NewsGuard, which is a content rating site. And they look at the percentage of engagements that came to stories from those iffy websites. So what they saw, and they did a great piece on this that you should check out, is actually in the time of coronavirus, there was a huge dip in the amount of stories that were being shared by these iffy sites. So I don't know if you have a slide there, Paul, that we want to look at while we do this.
I'll bring it up here.
Great, perfect. So there you see this huge dip, especially on Facebook, of content from those iffy sites. The engagement to those dipped from around 10% just before the coronavirus crisis to under 6.75%, so around 6.5% probably.
Okay, just so I understand the graph right, Ben, we're looking at like 8.5% being this, or 10% being this average amount of engagement with iffy content, and that stuff from partisan sites that have a liberal relationship with the truth.
Yes.
And then there's a huge drop in their percentage of engagement going to those sites right when coronavirus became the most intense, and then kind of sustained lower level of engagement afterwards.
Exactly. And that's what they refer to as the flight to quality. So, in a time of economic crisis, people often go back to the things that they know and trust. And they saw that here with kind of this media coverage. People wanted to know that they could trust. They weren't just engaging with things from websites they'd never heard of before. They were going to NBC, they were going to the New York Times, they were going to the Washington Post. So that is just something to be noted. And another thing is there was just a massive rise in engagement as well. So if you have a baseline level of engagement to these iffy sites, then if all the other sites are just getting more engagement, then that could be a factor in lowering this as well. Mm-hmm. But the good news is that people were turning to trusted news sources to engage with and share information about coronavirus.
So I would urge people to have a look at the iffy quotient. It's really interesting, and we've got a good blog post that Danielle will share in our show notes on the side here. But so misinformation is going down, but meanwhile, that's not the full story, Ben, right? There's QAnon, there's a whole lot of crazy misinformation around too.
Yeah, precisely. And I think one thing that should be noted, and I think this has been noted across the media, but I think it's really important for it to the conversation to happen beyond just the media, is that often true information is repurposed to fit a false narrative, or a morsel of truth is kind of nudge, nudge, wink, winked to a broader narrative that doesn't exist, because the person sharing it will know that the audience thinks that, and that is what they take away from it. So we actually have a really good example of this that was found by Kevin Roose of the New York Times. He writes about tech at the New York Times, and he tweeted this, and I believe he turned this into an article as well, which you can definitely find. And what he does is he looks at the engagement to links shared by Facebook pages every day. And he noticed on this occasion that 3 of the top 10 posts were this same story, and they were all about this Trump giving $35 million to aid human trafficking victims. And it's from the AP. So, I don't know that reputationally there is a more straight down the middle, facts only publication than the AP in terms of its reputation, at least. And they're looking at who shared it. It's a massive, massive story. 4.6 million is a huge story. But we have a clue here into what people were reading when they read this, even if they were reading the straight news story, by the audiences that it has been shared to. So look at the top engagements here. It's Donald Trump, it's Ivanka Trump, it's Brian Kemp, and it's Follow the White Rabbit, which is actually a QAnon pushing conspiracy page. And for those that don't know, that is a conspiracy that people at the top levels of government and society are running a massive pedophilia ring. I'd encourage people to read up on it from reporters that really know about it, because there's been some really great work on it in the last 2 years. But we see here people taking this very straight news story and using it to jump to the conclusions that they want to jump to because of kind of the known audience that this is being shared with. And I know you've talked about kind of the tribalism of audiences before, Paul.
Like, I was fascinated. This is one of the most extreme examples, and we are interpreting it a little bit to assume that this is, that the QAnon is what's driving the engagement with the story, but it's a huge level of engagement. Follow the White Rabbit and these other QAnon associated sites, it's clearly show that this story is going viral because it fits into a worldview around Donald Trump being on some kind of mission to dismantle a huge pedophilia and sex ring at the top levels of the US federal government involving sex trafficked people. And the story of misinformation, because Facebook will turn off the taps of traffic if you publish out and out fakes, And what we've really seen is very factual stories, but factual atomic units being reconstituted into fake news narratives. And QAnon is amazing because they'll grab onto little bits of real news and see them as reinforcing a completely fake meta story. And that's kind of hard to break down. And there's no, as you said, more reputable source than the AP. And this is a straight factual story, but it's now being pulled into this crazy narrative. So we'll have to do a whole webinar on this, but right now we want to get to one of the big stories of the week, right, Ben? We want to get to Kamala Harris's nomination.
Absolutely, yeah. And I know you wanted to show people what this looks like kind of live, so I'll set the scene while you do that. So obviously everybody knows now, I think, that Kamala Harris was picked as Joe Biden's running mate, and the biggest stories around that initially were all straight news stories. So, Kamala Harris picked as Joe Biden's running mate, all that kind of stuff. So we see that here. August 11th is when it was announced. We can see the level of interaction, just under 3 million from NBC News, and then other stories looking at that. But then what happens that's interesting when we change it to August 12th, which we'll do in a minute, is you can start to see some of the reactions that came through. So
we're going, sorry Ben, and to make it really clear, we're going from the day it was announced, and there's this huge engagement and positivity on the fact of the announcement and the historical notability. Then we go back to one day less and we strip those out, and then we see all of the reactions.
Exactly. So I think, you see a lot of negative coverage here from partisan sites, obviously. But then I think what's most interesting to me is, as someone who's a heavy Twitter user, is the thing that has actually been most discussed on Twitter was that article, the strange birtherism article about is Kamala Harris eligible to run for president, that's been widely debunked, obviously. But that's nowhere near the most engaged article, nowhere near the most engaged attack on her. I think, in fact, that only has around 70,000 engagements, the original article. Most of the articles about that are the ones debunking it, and they have far more engagements. But actually, when you look at the most engaged article, it was from the day that the VP nomination was announced, and it was about her gun control policy. And it was I think a website called Bearing Arms that claimed that Kamala Harris doesn't want anyone to have guns, that saw 1.5 million engagements. So I think we can get very wrapped up in the Twitter discourse, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, and it is an important thing to decry when something gets published that's like that. But actually, we have to be kind of data informed when we're looking at the narratives that actually broke through, and the gun control narrative was actually much more breaking through than the 14th Amendment narrative.
Yeah, so what we can see from which stories are getting engagement, liberal media is obsessed or spending a lot of energy on debunking this birtherism thread that's opened up. The conservative media is not actually engaging with that, but is instead engaging with Kamala Harris's positions on gun control, abortion, her questioning of Brett Kavanaugh during confirmation hearings. And so if you want to see what conservatives care about, you've got to look at what they're sharing as opposed to what liberal media is reacting to, or mainstream media is reacting to. And it's interesting that false claim, it's a good thing that false claim isn't getting traction, and hopefully it looks like conservative media is kind of taking her on her record a bit, as opposed to trying to delegitimize her as a candidate. So it's a little kind of bit of good news there.
Sure.
Now let's see, we that was kind of a good place for some questions. Covered a lot. We've looked at the big trends so far in the year in about 20 minutes. We could do a couple of questions and very briefly talk about what's coming up in 2 weeks' time as well.
Yeah, I saw someone in the chat there asked if we would share the deck. We'll probably, we'll also be doing a write-up of this on our blog that we'll send around to people as well. So that's definitely something that we're able to do.
Let's share the deck. Yeah. And we've got a question here. Do you predict engagement with Facebook content will be higher in Q3 than Q2? So is that graph going up? We've kind of touched on this already, Ben.
Yeah, I think, I'm reticent to make too many predictions, just because as this year has shown, you're never 100% certain what's around the corner. I would expect engagement to drop a little from the Q2 highs, at least for the first couple of months of Q3. And I think maybe that changes as we begin to approach the election in the US. That's when engagement might start picking up again. We saw another one of the biggest narratives was around Trump's impeachment. So political news really does have a lot of engagement to drive. So once we get to election season, truly, then we might start picking up again.
What a year. I love that there's a presidential election coming up, just to like top everything else off. Let's put the most controversial president in re-election into it as well. Just briefly, we might have another, we've only got a couple of minutes left and we do want to keep things moving on time. Are there any other questions, Danielle?
There is another one there I see. Who's getting more engagements, Trump or Biden? And what did we see during the previous election? That's a great question. So we actually are running a weekly piece with Axios that looks at exactly this. So looking at Trump and Biden engagements over time, and most of the time it's not even close. Trump is getting way more engagements. This week, maybe that might change. Stay tuned to the Axios piece to find out, just with the announcement of the VP. And then there's another question just come in asking how Kamala Harris compares. So I'll answer that at the same time. She has been lower generally than Biden, and way less than Trump, both of them. But then this week, Kamala Harris has been higher than Biden, and both higher than Trump, I think, in terms of those numbers. And just to quickly answer the part about the last election, we saw Trump get more engagements to content about him than Hillary Clinton did during the lead up to that election. And a lot of the news about Hillary Clinton was outright fake news that did really well.
Yeah, how 2020 will differ, probably both. I would predict this year there'll be more engagement on content about Trump, and a lot of that is rage clicks. And
certainly.
Engagement isn't positive, sentiment might be negative, but is for whatever reason, because of his dominance of the news cycle, may continue. What we won't see this year, when we looked at the most engaged 100 stories each about Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump in the 9 months leading up to the election, 40% of them were fake or so partisan as to be completely misleading. Mm-hmm. We won't see that this year because of how the networks have responded, but we will still see, as you said, the other kinds of misinformation that can creep in. And guys, we're nearly at the top of the hour, so I'm going to very briefly share kind of a couple. We kind of said these were some of the main takeaways here. We do have this content engagement explosion. The heartening news that in a crisis, the public really craves and shares facts. The celebration of pro-social action is something that we really think communicators should be watching out for this year, with all of the dangerous and scary news out there. And that reconstituted facts are the new misinformation. And those are all, I think, really big trends this year. And what we're going to be back here again in 2 weeks. If I can get to our last slide here to announce our special guest next week. We're going to have Jim Kennedy, who is a senior vice president of strategy at the AP. He's been at the AP when they've had very successful transitions to using AI, to a big focus on digital video and social media changes as well. And, Jim's in a great position to give us a view from how the AP membership are weathering 2020, what's going to happen to the news cycle and run up to the election, and how it is to be a news business that's still resolutely kind of reporting facts and not kind of breaking for one tribe or the other, but actually having to provide the facts to everyone. So please, if you want to come back here in 2 weeks' time, we'll be in the same place for a really interesting chat with Jim. Right now, I want to say a huge thanks to Ben. Any last words, parting words, Ben?
No, just thank you for having me, Paul. I hope it was useful for people. People can obviously contact us if they have any questions, marketing@newswhip.com, or I think we're all on Twitter, so find us on Twitter, either at NewsWhip or our personal accounts. And yeah, we'd love to hear your feedback or any other questions that you didn't get a chance to ask.
We will obsess, we promise to obsess over the minutiae of every piece of feedback that comes in, because we're just getting started at this. We want to make it a really valuable thing for all of our customers and friends. So please do send us back. We'll be hugely grateful, whatever way you can reach us with some feedback to receive it. Great.
Thanks, Paul.
Okay. Thanks very much, everyone. We will see you again in 2 weeks' time. Please invite your friends.